They drove off in a Mercedes. The car's chrome caught the morning sun and slid away down the street, and Rose and Anthony stood on the curb with a single suitcase between them and the lemon tree scent heavy in the air. For a moment, everything else in the world narrowed to that small suitcase, a worn leather handle, a zip that had frayed along the seam, a t-shirt folded with care, and the steady, impossible hum of an engine that meant someone had decided they were finished. The house behind them was the sort of small, stubborn place that held a life in its knots and paint chips, a green front door that had been a punchline on their wedding cards when they first painted it together, a kitchen window where the light always hit the counter just so, a wedding photograph in a wooden frame, the couple younger than they looked now, his arm loose around her shoulders, a ribbon of sunlight caught in both their smiles. There was a lemon tree in the backyard that Anthony had planted the year their youngest was born. Rose liked to say that if you kept your hands in the soil long enough, something would stay. They did not leave angry. There was no slammed door, no shouted accusations. There was, instead, the precise, bureaucratic calm of people who had practiced being reasonable until reason had become cold. Sandra had a folder clipped together with the kind of precision she used for balancing books. Robert's shoes were scuffed, his beard trimmed, his tie chosen to look casual. Benjamin hovered in the doorway like someone embarrassed to be noticed, and his pockets seemed fuller than his face suggested. They spoke in plans and gentle reassurances that sounded to Rose like a language for adults who never had to carry the weight of a whole household at the end of a day. Inside the kitchen that morning, Rose had been making breakfast the way she'd been making breakfast for 42 years. Eggs cracked into a pan with a sizzle, the scent of butter and a scrape of toast. She set 2 plates by the sink and arranged them carefully because the smallest things had always been how they kept going. Anthony put on his cardigan, his hands moving with the muscle memory of habitual modesty, the sleeve over the wrist, the button fastened with a thumb that had calved wood and planted seeds for decades. His hands were freckled and strong, the knuckles like small hills. He took his coffee in silence, and Rose read the paper aloud to him, simple headlines, the weather, a cartoon she could translate into a joke. They had given everything to their children without keeping a catalog. There had been science projects at the kitchen table with glue on their fingers, late-night casseroles for finals week, small loans that were never asked for back. Their home had been a harbor for scraped knees and for overnight stays, and a place where birthdays always meant a lemon bunt and a lighted candle. They had not expected gratitude to be ledgered. They had expected a circle of care, but people are capable of inventing logic for what servitude cannot be. Sandra said Sunrise Care was better. "We can visit," she said, as if visiting could replace all the small kitchens where they had warmed hands and told stories. Robert spoke about downsizing and safety with the easy tone of one who had never considered his parents' need to remain part of a neighborhood, a life, a familiar rhythm. Benjamin offered awkward apologies, then folded them neatly away. Their words were practical, as if they were arranging furniture. They never touched how it felt to choose a driveway over a life shared across decades. Rose watched them pack. She did not watch for arrogance. She watched for the familiar traces of their lives in the way they handled things. Sandra stacked bills and information pamphlets into that filled folder, with the same methodical calm she used with other people's accounts. Robert tucked a small velvet box into his briefcase and checked his watch. Benjamin seized a lemon from the bowl on the counter and held it up like a trophy before setting it down, then suddenly put his hands in his pockets as if embarrassed by the gesture. The moving van arrived without drama. The men who carried furniture into it were efficient, their work methodical. They wrapped cushions in plastic and placed a mirror in a crate. Rose stood at the sink and watched the van through the small kitchen window, the glass catching condensation like tiny hands. She felt a brittleness in her chest, like the sound of a bird trapped against a pane. Anthony came to stand beside her and put his hand on the stone of her back. He did not need to say that he was there. He had always been there. They packed a few things into a small suitcase, a cardigan, a pair of glasses, the photograph in its wooden frame wrapped in a towel. Rose slipped the wedding photo in last, smoothing the towel over the faces as if she could both protect them and keep them close. She tucked a lemon in the pocket because habit can be a talisman. The suitcase felt heavier than it should, loaded with years that do not register on postal scales. On the curb, the children spoke in the clipped tones of people arranging an adjustment. "It's better for them," Sandra said, looking at her clipboard as if the checkboxes could replace the embarrassments of the heart. Robert kissed his mother on the temple and offered his arm as if it were a courtesy to be given. Benjamin lifted his chin at his father and quickly turned away. The Mercedes idled across the street, chrome reflecting a tiny world, and the moving van door rolled up. Rose's voice, when she finally spoke, was small. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, and her question was not foolish because in it she asked what she had always asked when someone else had to shoulder her small life. Anthony looked at her with the same soft patience he'd had when she'd asked him to teach the children to fish. "We go," he told her, and his voice was steady in a way that made her laugh, not from humor but from the shock of the world being cleaved into a clarity she could not deny. "We go," he repeated, and together they walked to the van. There was a single moment, an almost silent beat, as the van's door closed and the Mercedes started to pull away. Rose watched the car lift its visor and turn, and for a second it looked like a small ship leaving a harbor. She held the suitcase with both hands. Anthony's fingers brushed hers. They both felt the small tremor of a life shifted. The lemon tree behind them stood with its fruit unplucked, and the green door they had painted together shimmered in the morning heat, its color now a quiet accusation. They arrived at Sunrise Care, not with the fanfare of an arrival, but with a list and a clipboard. A nurse with a small blue clipboard greeted them with the practiced softness of a person who is paid to reassure. The building smelled of disinfectant and a kind of institutional calm that tried to substitute for the messy, tender ways a family makes a home. Rose and Anthony were shown to a room that had 2 beds, a window overlooking a parking lot, a chair that had been bolted to the floor. There was a small framed print of a sailboat on the wall. It was the kind of art chosen to be unobjectionable. The first days at Sunrise were lined with a loneliness that had an almost animal cunning. Meals arrived at regulated times, trays balanced carefully. Conversations were punctuated by a polite distance that offered little in the way of warmth. There were other people in the room whose lives ran parallel to theirs. Dorothy, who watched the world from a corner with a map-like memory. Margaret, who refused to wear the card of pity and kept her hair in a plain bun. A man who insisted on arranging his cutlery as if ceremony could sustain him. Rose learned to keep her hands folded so the nurses would not think she was restless. She learned that the bonus of being known in a town, by a neighbor, the grocer, the church organist, did not follow you through the gates. Anthony grew quieter. It was not dramatic the way illness can be in novels. It was the small way a person arrives into less of themselves. He slept more. He mislaid words like coins. He sometimes stared for long minutes at the window, fingers unconsciously tracing the seam of the blanket, as if the light could teach him the contours of a day. Rose sat with him under the hum of white lights and read the same paragraph of a book, until the words softened into something that resembled contentment. If Sunrise had a saving grace, it was that it taught Rose the economy of small rebellions. She began slipping notes under doors for other residents who had no one, because the system was good at scheduling but poor at noticing. She brought a lemon rind to Margaret once and watched the old woman's face change, as if she had been given a secret. She carried eggs in her bag for a woman who preferred them plain and warm. In a corridor, she met Marcos for the first time, but it did not feel like a storybook meeting. He was simply a young mechanic who worked across the street and had come to fix a loose gate. His hands were stained with grease and he wiped them on his jeans with a sort of embarrassed pride. There was kindness in the way his eyebrows drew together when he listened. Days layered. Then there was a day Anthony did not wake. It was not cinematic, no collapse, no triumphant rescue, only a breath that slowed and went quiet. The staff did what staff do, called the attending physician, moved with gentle urgency, offered words of condolence that were efficient and kind. Rose sat with her palm over Anthony's hand and felt a small, overwhelming tiredness. She kept thinking of the lemon tree, of the wedding photograph wrapped in a towel, of the green door that was now a memory edged in paint chips. At the hospital, Rose's grief was a private, noisy thing. She prayed in a voice that belonged to her alone, not theatrical, not rehearsed. She pressed her lips together and whispered a small plea to whatever would listen, that she and Anthony might not be forgotten, that there might be someone who would stop if they saw a couple like them standing on the side of a road. It was less a doctrinal speech than a pleading for the human capacity to be seen. She did not promise miracles. She asked only for what felt like justice, attention, a shred of care, a neighborly hand. The highway answered before anyone else did. It was a thin moment, a few minutes of desperation where the world could have stayed indifferent. And a truck pulled over. Marcos was behind the wheel. He said later he had not intended to stop that day. He had been thinking of a part for his van and a sandwich for lunch. And then he saw two people on the shoulder with a small suitcase. There are people who keep a reserve of decency and are surprised to find it used. Marcos had that kind of decency. He leaned across the cab and asked simply, "You folks okay?" Rose looked at him and felt as if she could breathe for the first time in weeks. "We need a hand," she said, and she meant it in the most literal way. Marcos, who had a kind of patient directness, put down his sandwich and helped them into his truck. Anna, his wife, who would prove to be the kind of organizer who keeps things moving, was waiting at the clinic parking lot with a thermos of tea and a towel. They did not have much of anything in common at first glance: age and youth, calloused hands and practiced efficiency. But Rose had been taught to recognize help when it came with no ledger attached. They took Anthony to the emergency room. The antiseptic smell was sharp enough to make the edges of things clear. Nurses moved around them like birds in a practiced pattern. Where Sunrise Care had been a background of institutional care, the hospital was an upfront machine of attention. They ran tests, they checked vitals, they explained things in clipped professional sentences. Marcos sat through it all with his elbows on his knees as if the waiting room could be a small vigil. When the doctor spoke in private, she used the careful language the profession favored. Phrases that buffered bluntness with empathy. Complications, frailty, we will do our best. It did not matter whether her words offered hope. They were couched in humanity. Rose listened and felt the world both contract and open. She had been moved by the sting of abandonment, and now she felt an odd relief that a stranger was telling her what to expect. It made the day make sense in a way the polite cruelty of a moving plan never could. After hours of waiting, after a bed had been found and a procedure performed that didn't promise reversal, but did promise attention, Marcos and Anna offered a small house where the two of them could recover. "We have a room," Anna said, the way one offers a cup of tea. "Not much, but it's ours." They were not wealthy. Marcos's truck was old and dear. Anna's apron had flour in the pockets. But their kindness arrived with a clarity Rose had forgotten existed. It did not come with conditions or with an itemized bill. It came with a spare key and a promise to fix the faucet if it leaked. There were small rebellions in accepting help, as Rose knew. Pride is a patient thing. It does not announce itself with trumpets. She debated briefly whether to be a burden. Anthony, who had never liked a fuss, took his cardigan off slowly and said, "We go," in the same resigned voice he had used on the curb, and Rose felt her heart tilt toward the possibility of a different kind of familyhood, one chosen and present. The house that Marcos and Anna offered was modest. Its living room smelled faintly of motor oil and laundry soap. A bookshelf leaned a little. Its spines were a mixture of instruction manuals and novels whose pages had turned a faithful number of times. There was a spare bed covered in a quilt someone had stitched by hand, and a small table by the window, where light pooled in the afternoon. Rose placed the wedding photograph on that table, as if setting a small altar. She smoothed the towel and arranged the faces to look out toward the light. Anna made tea and set 2 warm cups before Rose and Anthony. The gesture was ordinary and enormous. They talked like people relearning their shapes. Marcos spoke about the neighborhood, the hardware store that still had an old owner who knew everyone's name, the mechanic's jokes about timing belts and tomatoes. Anna listened and nodded, and told stories about organizing potlucks. Their talk had no pity. It had instead a steady, practical tenderness that made Rose think of the lemon tree, and how a single fruit could sweeten a place. That night, as Anthony slept with the quiet breath of someone who had been afraid for a while, and was now permitted softness, Rose sat by the window. The street beyond was modest. Porch lights pinned people's sittings into little islands. She took the lemon from her pocket and rolled it in her palm, and the oil from the peel slipped into the air like a memory. She thought of the green door and how it had closed behind them, not like a slam, but like a seal. She thought of the way their children had spoken, and of the way they had once cradled a newborn beneath a thin blanket and declared it the center of everything. Rose did not craft a plan that night. She was not the sort to conceive a legal strategy over a cup of tea. What she felt was the beginning of a tightening in her chest that had more to do with agency than vengeance. There was an order to life she wanted to restore, an insistence that things belonged to people who remembered to show up. The kindness of Marcos and Anna had something to do with clarity. There are people who build lives by showing up, and there are people who build lives by filing papers and making plans. Both had their merits. One had the sturdier, beating heart. Outside, a dog barked for a while and then stopped. Rose smoothed the photograph with her fingertips until the wood warmed to her touch. She breathed in the faint scent of lemon and felt the edges of fear and relief blur. There would be decisions to make, calls to answer, calls that might not be returned. There would be a reckoning if it came, and she had no appetite for spectacle. But there was, too, a small and simple principle she clung to, that money and titles and tidy justifications could not buy the things people gave freely. Presence, willing hands, a neighbor's knock at the right hour. She slept in a sort of watchful exhaustion, and when she woke the house was quiet except for the kettle on the stove. Marcos had left early to open his shop. Anna was already sorting a list of errands. Anthony lay wrapped in a blanket, and for a while Rose simply sat and watched the slow, even rise and fall of someone she had loved longer than she had named her loyalties. The city moved on. People went to work and to school and to the small errands that stitch a community together. And somewhere in a neat office, perhaps, plans were being finalized that had nothing to do with heartbeats. On the counter by the door sat a small envelope someone had placed there with a careful hand. 2 words typed on the front in a polite font. For Rose. It was not the sort of envelope one expects. Rose picked it up with a small curiosity. It was heavy for its size. Her hands trembled not with anticipation but with the kind of hope that has to be tempered so as not to erupt. She slid a finger under the flap and found a card with a line of handwriting she recognized. A neighbor who had been meaning to call. A church member who had lost track, someone who had been embarrassed by a delay. The message inside was simple and kind. The envelope felt like a small, secret restoration, a quiet proof that not everyone had turned away. Rose smiled a small, tired smile and set the card in her hands like a talisman. She did not know then that an entire chain of hidden notices, of letters that had never been delivered and envelopes that had been tucked away, existed elsewhere. She did not know that a future knock would come that would change everything in ways she could not yet imagine. For the moment, the world had narrowed to tea and a photograph, and the sound of soft laughter from the next room where Anna was clearing plates. Marcos returned in the afternoon with grease on his knuckles and a grin, as if life had promised nothing and still kept delivering small surprises. He came in carrying a bag of groceries, one of those small, steady gestures that says without saying, people count on one another. Anna says we have fresh eggs, he announced, setting the bag down with a thunk that sounded like punctuation. They all laughed, a sound that felt almost scandalous in its brightness. And Rose thought of the eggs she'd made that morning in a kitchen that belonged to someone else now. In the days that followed, the little house became a temporary harbor. Anthony grew steadier. He began to sit in the sunlight at the window, to hum old songs that had lodged in house rafters since the children had been small. Rose found a small place for her hands. She began to bake lemon cookies in a borrowed pan, and to pass them around the neighborhood like a contraband of civility. People came and went. Sometimes Sandra called, voice flattened with the weight of logistics. Sometimes Robert texted an image of his lunch, as if food could substitute for what he'd left behind. Benjamin sent a string of messages that read more like remorse than apology, but remorse still required work, and for the moment Rose was content to let it be a seed. There were nights when she woke and imagined the house at the corner where they had lived. She pictured the green door, the paint slightly peeling, the lemon tree in its small plot, the wedding photograph still in the familiar frame. She wondered whether the photograph had been placed in a drawer or tucked into a moving box with other things of no consequence. She wondered whether the children would think to call. It was a practical question, and an intimate one. She did not expect everything to be repaired by a square of cardboard with a bow. She expected instead the slow accretion of kindness and the occasional indignity of reality. One afternoon, while Marcos was at the shop and Anna at a community meeting, Rose sat with the photograph in her lap and read the names written on the back of it in a hand she knew. The names of the children, the date of a wedding, a note about a favor returned. She felt the paper between her fingers and thought of legacy. Not the legal instruments that families sometimes use to divide property, but the quieter kind. The ways you teach someone to tie a tie, the way you leave a recipe, the memory of a small laugh passed down like a coin. She thought about what it meant for a legacy to be used as a weapon rather than as a stewardship. The idea of revenge had a tempting edge. It glowed with the immediacy of pain. But her sense of justice was not about cruelty, it was about restoration. Outside, life moved in little predictable ways. The neighbor's dog barked. A delivery came and the postman waved. A woman moved across the street with boxes stacked in the back of a pickup, and Rose watched her with the older empathy of someone who has learned that moves are both endings and beginnings. The sunlight touched the lemon rind in her hands and made it gilded for a second. She did not yet know about the letters that had been withheld. She did not know about any legal arguments waiting to be made, about signatures unnoticed, about envelopes that had been tucked away like secrets. All she knew was the small geometry of days: wake, tea, conversation, a walk in the afternoon to the small park where the bench fit them like an old pair of gloves. Anthony would hold her hand, as if it were a pledge to keep walking together. She would respond with a small squeeze because it was the only language they had left sometimes, a promise in muscle memory. At night, when the house settled and Anna hummed a song while washing dishes, Rose would sometimes go out and stand at the stoop, smelling the faint oil of the streets and the lemon-sweet air that seemed to cling to her fingers. She would picture their old house and the green door, and the way it had looked that morning as the Mercedes carried away the people who had been their children. The image still stung, but it had a kind of clarity that allowed a plan to form not as a bludgeon, but as a measure. There would be choices to make, but for the present the choice was simple. Accept the hand that extended itself without ledger, sleep with the sound of a kettle boiling, and the quiet warmth of someone who cares. Anthony slept more easily now that he was tended to. Rose found herself waking with a small, persistent thought, that what one bequeaths is not only money or property, but the structures we build for the day-to-day of being human. She wanted, in the shadowed part of her thinking, a future where elders were not traded like papers, where a list of conveniences could not step into the stead of a neighbor who knocks. It was a small salvation, this house on a side street, but it was a real one. The next morning, while the sky washed pink and then blue, Rose brewed coffee and set 2 cups on a table. She unfolded the photograph and looked at the faces she had kept through years of small loyalty. She placed the photograph near the plate of lemon cookies and thought about home as something that could be moved and rebuilt rather than lost. She thought of the green door, and for the first time it registered differently in her mind, not as a closed gate but as a color she could paint elsewhere. When the courier came later that week with a thick envelope addressed in block letters, Rose did not expect what was inside. She opened it at the kitchen table with hands that had cooked and changed diapers and tended scraped knees. The paper inside smelled faintly of printer ink and the sort of bureaucratic order that tries to impose meaning on events. There were papers, yes, but they were not the ones she feared. For the moment, The envelope contained only a sheet acknowledging receipt of a forwarded communication and a stamped notice that some documents had been returned to sender. It was small and oddly ceremonial, and it tugged at a memory she had, that important things are sometimes announced in envelopes that arrive too late. She folded the paper and set it aside. Something in the fold whispered that other papers existed elsewhere, that someone had made decisions in offices and at kitchen tables, far from the small beating heart of a lemon tree. Rose pressed her thumb to the photograph and felt the grit of years. She did not know the shape of the consequences. She had never been someone who plotted retribution. But she possessed a slow moral engine that could not help but consider how to make a wrong right. For now, though, the house held them. For now, they had soup that Anna had made, and the soft, steady presence of people who knew how to fix leaks and how to make tea. For now, Anthony's breath came in easier measures. And for now, Rose had a decision to make that would not be made in haste. How to use the remaining days to secure not humiliation but a home, for themselves, and perhaps for others who might one day find themselves standing on a curb with a suitcase and the smell of lemon filling the air. When she went to bed that night, photograph under one hand and lemon rind in the other, Rose did not think of vengeance as a bright, satisfying end. She thought, instead of architecture, what it would mean to take a life lived with care and channel it not back into a private ledger, but into a place where care could be institutionalized without becoming sterile. She thought of neighbors who show up and of small rooms that keep people warm. She thought of turning pain into provision. Outside, the green door across the street glowed in a memory she could carry with her. She did not suspect that a chain of unseen envelopes and muffled decisions would later produce a revelation that would force their children to look at what they had done. She did not yet know that the very file Sandra had clipped in her hands might contain a record that, left unread, would later prove essential. She did not know the shape of the legal ingenuity that was to come, nor the way the word revenge would be softened into stewardship. At dawn, Anthony woke and took her hand in the gentle, unremarked way he'd always done. "We go," he said. And it was not acquiescence now, but consent, to whatever would follow, to the unspooling of events that might lead to sorrow or to a strange sort of justice. Rose pressed her thumb to his knuckles and let the morning settle. The lemon scent from her pocket rose and anchored her to a reality that promised both fragility and invention. On the street outside, someone swept a stoop. In the little house, Anna was humming and the kettle was coming back to a boil. Marcos's truck hummed as he backed out to the shop. Rose tucked the photograph into her cardigan for safekeeping. She felt something in that pocket like a seed. It would need soil and time and tending. She had weathered worse. She would see this through. The knock came on an ordinary Tuesday, soft and patient, like someone who knew the right rhythm for interrupting a life that was already full. Rose opened the door to find a man in a suit that fit as if it belonged to a different decade, navy, sensible, a small silver pen in his breast pocket. He offered a card with the kind of quiet authority that made paper feel important. His name was Henry Brooks. He said he was with a law firm downtown and had something to deliver in person. Rose's first thought was that this must be about some minor formality, an overdue signature or a forwarded invoice. She invited him in out of the habitual hospitality that had always been woven into her veins. The house smelled of lemon and bread. The wedding photograph sat in its place near the window where light pooled like a small blessing. Henry glanced at it and smiled with a softness Rose appreciated. He asked about Anthony in a voice that balanced professionalism with the human pauses you use when you don't want to rush grief. He sat at the kitchen table and slid a thick manila folder across the wood. When Rose touched the edge, she felt the weight of fastened papers and the kind of precision that says attention has been given. Henry leaned forward and told them what he had come to say as one might deliver complicated medicine, with care and without theatricality. "It appears," he said, "that Mr. Graham, Anthony's grandfather, executed a will some years before passing away, and the estate included several properties and a financial portfolio that, at today's accounting, amounts to just over $20 million. Rose's hand found the edge of the table. The words did not swell into trumpets. They hovered instead, as if Henry had opened a window onto an unexpected room. He explained that the firm had attempted to notify Mr. and Mrs. Graham at the address the documents listed. Notices had been sent. Letters were stamped and recorded. The firm had a chain of custody. They had delivery confirmations and signatures, and in some months, notices had been returned. There were dates, signatures, and envelopes entered into the file. Henry spoke plainly as a man who had spent a life translating paper into consequence. Rose listened and felt that peculiar sensation of a tide that arrives too late to do anything about the particular loss it washes over, but early enough to sit on the new shore and think. She did not feel elation. She felt a chill of that clear, small truth that things were larger than the hurt they had inflicted. Anthony squeezed her hand once. His fingers were thinner now, but they held with the same easy authority he'd always had. He did not ask questions that Henry had come prepared to answer. He only looked at Rose as if to ask whether she had room in her mind for yet another strange turn. Henry unfolded a sheet with a list of dates. "There is, however," he said, "a complicated pattern. Notices addressed to your home were, according to our records, signed for on multiple occasions but then marked return to sender. Some correspondence arrived at the post office and doesn't appear to have been redirected to you." He did not accuse. He said, "According to our records," with a tone that made it clear he knew how to place weight on paper without making it a weapon. He placed before them copies of acknowledgments stamped with dates across roughly 31 months. Stamps of dispatch, initials, courier logs. Rose's voice when she found it was small and practical. "Do you mean someone intercepted our mail?" "It appears," Henry said, "that there were other hands involved." He carefully avoided legal jargon that would read like accusation. "I'm presenting what the firm has compiled. If you wish to pursue further, we can. If you choose another path, we'll ensure your interests are protected. Right now, the choice is yours." Rose had never thought of herself as someone who makes bold legal choices. She thought of the lemon tree and the green door, of the small transactions that add up to a life. She thought of the way the children had treated their home as if it were a ledger rather than a place where memories accumulated like pennies in a jar. Small, ordinary, relentlessly accumulating. She felt no appetite for spectacle. Yet the papers on the table were not only evidence, they were also an opportunity. Henry folded his hands. "The will names Anthony as beneficiary. The estate is intact. Properties and securities are in the firm's custody pending instructions. The firm will, of course, do as you direct." He watched Rose for the smallest sign. "We could begin probate actions. We could make claims, but there's another option. You can control how this is used. You can decide a plan now to provide income and care that suits you both." Rose paused. Outside the window, a child chased a pigeon and the sound of summer scraped the edges of the room into bright, ordinary noise. She remembered how, once upon a time, they'd imagined futures in small sketches. Someday a new roof, a repainted fence, a kitchen with room for all of their children. Those pictures had been painted with trust. Instead, trust had been cataloged into boxes and placed on a van. Anthony's voice came as it always had. Even in its quiet, it held the authority of someone who had built things with his hands. "We go," he said, not because he relented, but because he had always chosen movement over stasis. His eyes met Rose's. "What do you want, Rose?" She thought of the evenings he had fixed chairs and their small rituals, of the sound of his boots in the yard when he checked the lemon tree each spring. She felt a flood of small domestic griefs, dented pots, a torn apron, a child's handwriting on a school certificate glued to the refrigerator. Her response did not arrive as a flourish. It came as a sentence that fit like a tile into the kitchen mosaic they'd always had. "We build a place where people are not set aside like furniture." Henry studied her like one who was cataloging a turn. "You mean a home?" "A home," Rose said. The word vibrated in her mouth. "Not just a house. A home for people who've been left to the edges. A place like the one we've been given." She touched the photograph near the window and let the memory of decades sit on her fingertips. Marcos, who had become a daily presence, arrived at the house soon after Henry left. He came with a sunburned face and the persistent practicality of a man who measures life in practical terms. He and Anna sat with Rose at the table, and Henry explained the situation again, this time for the ears of people who had become family. Marcos folded his hands in the way of men who find moral certainties easy to declare, but harder to construct. "I'm not going to be the reason another person feels what you two felt on that curb," Marcos said, and the sentence fell into the room with a directness that left no space for interpretive dance. "If you want to build something, I'm in. Not because I like paperwork, but because I know how to make a roof stop leaking and how to move a wall." Anna exhaled a laugh that tasted like relief. She had the knack for logistics that made the shape of projects appear less like chaos and more like a plan. "We can do this quietly," she said. "We don't need banners. We need a property, a plan for long-term funding, and a team who believes in doing it properly." Over the next weeks, small decisions multiplied like seeds. Henry advised them in the language of professionals. The firm would secure the assets, set up a trust to fund a non-profit, draft articles that specified the purpose and governance. He spoke of trustees and lifetime stipends, and the necessity of clear intent. He used terms that made the plan sound institutional and sensible, and he never lapsed into spectacle. He added that the records the firm had compiled about the undelivered notices would be added to the corporate file, not necessarily as a spectacle, but as documentation. If the children wished to contest, they could. The firm would ensure a fair accounting. The emphasis was always on control, on the ability to direct wealth toward a purpose that mattered. Rose listened to the law speak as one listens to a complicated hymn. She did not feel thrill so much as the soft, steady recognition that she could shape the way her story met the future. Anthony, who had never wanted to be a public figure, accepted Henry's words with the same practical gravity he had used to measure timber and mortar. "If we do this," he said, "do it for the right reasons. Make it a place where people are seen." They chose a modest name that still sounded like a promise: Rose House. It was not flashy. It did not boast about retribution. It proclaimed the idea at the center of the decision, that money can be redirected into infrastructure of care. The plan was to seed the trust, guarantee Rose and Anthony's needs for life, and build Rose House as a non-profit home for seniors who had been abandoned or whose families could not care for them. It would be open, accountable, and modeled on the humility that had restored Rose and Anthony. Shared meals, private rooms touched by familiar objects, a garden that smelled of lemon and thyme. The firm drew the documents with methodical care. Henry took the role of counsel at first, then, through many conversations, morning coffees, and hours spent listening to the ways Rose and Anthony wanted their days to be, his job shifted. He found a place in the work that exceeded what law school had planned. He began to tend to the garden as plans turned to shovels. In time, those who had come to him as client would come to him as kin, and he would be found planting roses with dirt under his nails, a scarf around his neck like someone who had always been meant to swap a briefcase for a trowel. Word traveled, but not in cloying bursts. Neighbors and people who'd once bought vegetables from Marcos's sister's stall came to volunteer. People arrived with hammers and with pie. The project's first major hurdle was a property. A small brick house on the edge of town with a yard large enough for citrus and a leaning garage that smelled like oil and old rope. It had once belonged to a man who kept bees and who had left it to rot when his knees failed. The seller, an estate agent with soft eyes, understood the gravity of the offer and waved a small blessing with her hand. Building began in a way that felt like prayer, methodical, repetitive, and made by hands. Marcos led a group of tradespeople whose skills had once been anonymous in the daily work of towns, but who, when asked, arrived with blueprints folded and a quiet eagerness. Anna organized schedules and donations, forged relationships with a small bank for a line of credit, arranged a potluck where neighbors brought ladles as donations. Henry navigated forms and filings, and then in the afternoons he learned how to prune roses. Rose came to the site often, walking with Anthony in a borrowed cardigan, the lemon scent trailing like punctuation. She had a small notebook where she kept ideas, a shelf by the window for photographs, hooks in the entry for coats, a table by the garden for lemon tea. She insisted on small domestic points, good lighting in the dining room, a place to hang a calendar where birthdays could be circled. These were not frivolities, they were the architecture of dignity. The children appeared, each in their own time and with their own cadence. Sandra, immaculate as ever, arrived first, her hair a glossy frame to a face that had practiced firmness for a lifetime. Robert's arrival was punctuated by a polite stiffness. He had not expected the house to smell like lemon. Benjamin, thinner and less guarded than before, walked up cautiously as if approaching a fragile bird. They parked a Mercedes on a street near the work site, as if to assert a world they'd come from, a world of schedules and returns on investments. The car's chrome caught the sun and sexted reflections across the siding. They paused at the gate and looked out at men laying floorboards and volunteers painting a porch white. For a moment, Rose watched them with a kind of calm that had nothing to do with fury and everything to do with clarity. They wanted to talk about inheritance, about the money that had been discovered like a long-forgotten coin in a sofa. They asked questions that were legal and practical, and at times tender in a way that suggested regret more than entitlement. Henry met them briefly on the porch and explained the situation with the restrained language of his profession. He noted that the firm had documented instances of withheld communications, that the estate law gave the decedent the power to name beneficiaries, and that their options included contest. He also explained, again and again, that the decision ultimately rested with the beneficiaries and the will's terms. Sandra's voice was steady in the way of those who have practiced corporate sentences. "We deserve to know how this happened," she said. "We want clarity about the file and—" Her list, like the folder she'd once carried, had its neat boxes. She did not, at first, raise her hand to touch the lemon-scented air of the yard, where apprentices knelt to lay tile. Robert, who had always been good at translating emotion into currency, cleared his throat. "We can find a way to work with this," he said, the phrase a practiced bridge. He wanted to propose partnerships, to ensure their parents were comfortable, to consult. "We don't want to be excluded." Benjamin moved his feet like a man trying re-enter a threshold he'd once crossed without thinking. He had changed. The hardness that fit him like armor had softened into the brittle honesty of regret. "I should have done more," he said in a voice that shook. I didn't mean to hide things. I wasn't brave enough." He looked at his parents with something that could be taken for shame or for the rawness of someone waking up. Anthony's response was not a rebuke. He had learned in the years where wood yielded to the plane and the grain taught him patience, that there is a time for words and a time for a look. He stood with the sun catching his side of the face and said simply, "You left us on a curb." It was not an explosive accusation. It landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples were quiet but certain. The children, who had practiced reason as if it were a shield, found their defenses inconvenient. Sandra's lips pressed together. Robert's gaze flicked to the men painting the porch. Benjamin's shoulders slumped. "We chose a different path," Anthony continued. "You chose roads that took you away. You said you would visit. Plans were made. Plans can be like maps drawn by people who never mean to cross them." Rose watched him with a tenderness that cut through the scene. She had no desire to inflame. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than any lecture. "When money comes," she said, "you can choose to make it a thing that erases what was wrong, or you can choose to make it a thing that rebalances what has been broken." That night, there was a fragile dinner, plates of modest pasta and a lemon tart that Rose had insisted upon, where the family tried on an awkward civility. Sandra asked procedural questions about the records. Robert tried to find the right tone for making amends. Benjamin offered to help with the build in ways that were more than symbolic. None of them were villainous. They were, instead, people who had made missteps and now stood in the clearing where decisions happen. The wound was not a spectacle. It was a quiet moral geography that required cartography. As legal papers were finalized, Henry guided the establishment of the Rose House Trust, with the same care he'd used to prune a rose bush. He ensured that Rose and Anthony had guaranteed income for life, that the trust's mission would be explicitly to provide homes for elders at risk of abandonment, that governance structures would prevent the mission from being diverted. He also suggested a small clause, one that preserved the dignity of their children without restoring full claim. The children would receive nominal tokens, symbolic amounts that communicated something the trust did not intend to crowd out, that financial inheritance is not the same as the work of being present. The clause was a deliberate, measured counterbalance, not cruelty, not erasure, but a moral tether to remind. When the formal reading of the will was arranged, it was done without fanfare. A small group gathered in the workroom on a folding table: Rose, Anthony, Henry, Marcos, Anna, and the contractor who would oversee the build. The will was read in a voice that was steady as a metronome. Assets were enumerated, properties listed, stocks and holdings named with the careful cadence of someone cataloging a legacy. And then the heart of it. The Rose House Trust would receive the funds necessary to establish and maintain the nonprofit in perpetuity. The trust would guarantee Rose and Anthony's comfort and provide for the care of other elders who needed a home. The document, as Henry read it, left one small human space for the children. A token sum, symbolic, almost theatrical, a single $1 to each of the three, with a note appended in Anthony's handwriting. Rose felt the sudden lightness of a breath released as Henry unfolded the small sheet. Anthony's letter had been brief, his prose economical as the man himself. To Sandra, Robert, and Benjamin, Henry read, there is a difference between giving and showing up. This $1 is a reminder that money cannot remake the love you once practiced. I hope you come to understand the second before you let another person stand alone. Love, A. It was not a spiteful note. It was a tender reprimand. It refused to be a spectacle. It asked something of them. Presence, not theater. Benjamin's shoulders shook. He folded the $1 into a palm and cradled it like a relic. Sandra's jaw clenched, and Robert's eyes flicked to the men painting the porch outside as if he wanted to learn humility from the way a volunteer measured a board. The children argued, briefly and not always coherently, about their rights and about how the trust might function. Henry listened and offered ways to engage constructively. A seat on the advisory board that required no power to divert funds, but provided a place to help with bake sales and to volunteer. The offer was a door, small and practical. Some took the door and some did not. Benjamin, surprisingly, became the first to kneel in the garden and hold a trowel, his fingers learning how to place a plant in an exacting hole. His hands, once used to an office keyboard, found a new muscle memory in soil. He stayed long after the others left and washed dirt from his grips, with the absurd humility of someone trying to atone. Sandra visited too, but in a different way. She examined budgets and suggested ways to make the trust more sustainable. She offered gifts of financial literacy workshops for the staff. Robert donated an old truck the team used to haul supplies. Their shapes of return were imperfect, but they were return. Construction on Rose House unfolded in a rhythm that was both mechanical and oddly intimate. There was a time-lapse of foundation poured and walls raised, a movement that might have been majestic if it were not so stubbornly filled with the ordinariness of labor. Marcos orchestrated teams of volunteers with the calm focus of a man who trusted people to want to do the right thing. Anna organized meal trains and schedules so that the builders had coffee and soup waiting at the end of a day. The neighborhood contributed small things: quilts, a piano moved down a narrow lane, a humming kettle. Children painted a mural of lemons and hands on a wall near the entrance. It was crude and perfect. As the place took shape, Rose insisted on small, crucial elements. Each room would have a shelf for photographs. Each resident would be asked on arrival whether they wanted a lemon tree planted near their window, a small ritual that meant someone had thought their small preferences through. Henry found himself planting seeds on a day where his hands were smudged with soil and his suit sleeves abandoned on a folding chair. He laughed, and Rose laughed with him. Their ease a sign that the project had become a thing that didn't just belong to a checklist, but to a community. There were residents who came with histories braided into silence. Dorothy arrived with keen eyes that had the map of memory folded into their rims. Margaret moved in with the steadiness of someone who had learned how to keep dignity tidy when the world unmade it. Henry, as it turned out, found himself spending afternoons teaching men how to prune roses, and then opening a small desk in the back room where he accepted donations of old tools and sometimes letters. The house offered not only physical shelter but a place to tell stories. On an evening when rain drummed on the roof, residents sat in a circle and traded the names of songs they had loved. It was nothing dramatic, just music and tea and the way people circle one another when they have found a place. Anthony settled into an easy routine at Rose's house. He would sit by the garden and watch the rhythm of people coming and going. He told jokes in the morning and fell asleep in his chair in the afternoon. He developed a gentle habit of leaving small notes on the morning shelf for Rose. Little observations, a single line about the weather, a comment about the lemon tree. The house gave him a certain peace that made his breaths easier. On some evenings he would bellow out a tune from his youth, and the residents would clap a bit too loudly, embarrassed that they had fun, the way people sometimes are when delight feels like a disobedient thing. When his time came, it was as ordinary as life had been, quiet, unsurprising, held by hands that had learned to be steady. He took Rose's hand and looked at the garden just beyond the window, at the lemon tree they had planted by the back fence, its new shoots like a promise, and he said, "It was right," the words small and satisfied. There were no theatrics. There was only the clarity of completion. Afterwards, the house hummed with condolence. People came bearing pies and stories, folding their grief into the routines that made living possible. Rose's grief was not a shattering, though it could have been, but a reorganization. She found, in the softness that followed, an attention that made the days bright with small tasks. To oversee the compost, to ensure the Friday tea was properly sweetened, to read to a man who had little appetite for words but liked the sound of them. Rose discovered a new kind of authority in these acts. It was not the authority of orders, but the quieter authority of one who had learned where to place levity and where to be still. In the years that followed, Rose's house became a small beacon. People learned its rhythms, the morning singing, the slow shuffling chess players in the library, the lemon pies cooling on the sill. The trust provided stipends for staff, paid for maintenance, and underwrote scholarships for apprentices who wanted to learn caregiving as a trade. Henry, once a man of paper and precedent, became its gardener, then a fixture who baked bread on Sundays. Marcos taught a summer class on basic carpentry, and Benjamin, who had once been the most embarrassed of their children, became the person who could fix a leaking roof at dawn. Not everything healed. The children who had turned their parents out of the house never entirely erased the awkwardness between them and the new community. There were visits full of apology and awkward laughter. There were silences that meant more than any speech. But there were also moments of reconnection. Robert learning to carry a tray and finding he liked the rhythm. Sandra offering to lead a class on budgeting for elders. Benjamin reading at bedtime to a resident who loved droning poems. People grew in ways that were not dramatic but true. They repaired themselves in the seams left by honest labor. Rose grew older and smaller in some ways, but her spirit kept the clear architecture of determination. She would walk the garden each morning, fingers trailing along the lemon tree's rough leaves, and she would pass on small bits of wisdom to the staff. How to make tea strong enough to warm a cup, how to fold a shawl so it keeps someone comfortable at night. Her last years were full of ordinary pleasures. The green paint of the door facing the garden that she had insisted on. An homage to the door they'd once had. Small quilts sewn by volunteers, and the hush of people who had stopped abandoning each other. Shortly before she died, Rose wrote a letter. It was the sort of short note that carries a weight disproportionate to its size. She sat at the small table near the window where the light pooled and wrote in a hand that had taught generations how to tie shoes and to whisper goodnights. It was addressed not only to the people who had been part of her life, but to the future of a house she had helped make. Her words were brief and crystalline. A home is what happens between people who show up. She folded the letter and left it in the trust's file, alongside the documents Henry had kept, and the small ceremonial dollars Anthony had assigned to their children. She died in the quiet of the house with a lemon-scented room and the sound of someone humming old songs. The staff and the residents gathered and told stories. They remembered, not only the sorrow that had once sat on the curb, but the fullness of what had been made aloud. The news spread gently. People came from town and from neighborhoods further away to see the house that had been born from a reluctant inheritance. Volunteers taught caregiving classes that used dignity as a textbook. Families who feared abandonment saw a model for what was possible when wealth is redirected. Donors arrived careful and humbled. The trust grew not by spectacle, but through the steady business of care. Years later, when the board met for a quiet anniversary, they read letters sent from residents who had once been alone. "There's a woman," they said, "who had no one, and who now tended a small herb patch. A man who had stopped speaking but who now sang the names of his grandchildren aloud to anyone who would listen." They spoke of the lemon tree that had grown taller than anyone had expected, its branches heavy with fruit. They spoke of how the green door had become a symbol not of exclusion, but of passage, of entry into a place that had been built to hold. Sandra, Robert, and Benjamin each found small ways back into the orbit. None was perfect. Each did the work they could manage, some days more humbly than others. They did not receive the fortune they might have expected, but they received instead something more specific, a chance to learn presence. Sandra organized annual financial workshops at Rose House for relatives and neighbors. Robert donated time on weekends. Benjamin led an apprentice program for young men who wanted to learn construction and respect. The city outside moved on as cities do. New houses were painted. Children were born. Old men found new seats at buses. Rose House did not remake the world, but it shifted a neighborhood's gravity. People learned to knock on each other's doors again. A grocery store started a neighbor's hour for elders with reduced prices. A church formed a small volunteer schedule. Small revolutions of civility began to feel less like oddities and more like expectations. On one mild autumn afternoon, when the lemon tree's branches shivered with fruit and the green door glowed as if remembering another season, the Rose House held a small ceremony. It was not a grand unveiling, but a quiet day marked by pie and tea and the small shaking hands of those who had been given a second chance. Henry stood and said nothing for a while. His hands were still smudged with soil, and his voice, when he did speak, carried the ordinary tone of someone who had watched an idea be made real. He told the room about the afternoons he'd spent pruning, and about the first time he realized that law could be a tool for kindness rather than a club for the well-shod. Marcos gave a short practical speech about how roofs keep out the rain, and how people keep out the ache of loneliness. He spoke of the day on the highway when he and Anna had found Rose and Anthony, of the small decision to stop that had led to a house. He did not make more of it than it was. Marvels in his telling were the normal stuff of human decency. Benjamin, no longer ashamed but humbly proud, placed a small drawer in the kitchen where residents could deposit notes for one another. He had learned how to arrive and stayed. Sandra inaugurated a tiny scholarship for caregivers to receive training. Robert had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, become the organizer of the annual repair day. Even the modest Mercedes that had once driven away stood in a different light, a thing that had carried people who had made a painful choice and who were now learning a new version of presence. When Rose's letter was read aloud that day, the room grew still. Her handwriting leaned to the right, patient and firm. "A home is what happens between people who show up," Henry read, and the words landed like a bell. They were not a closure, but a call to keep coming. People clapped softly. They planted another lemon tree near the side gate, and the volunteers sang a song in an odd little chorus, voices going tenor and alto and something in between. Later that week, a reporter from a local paper wrote a short piece about Rose House. The headline was careful, not mawkish. From abandonment to agency, how one family's pain funded a neighborhood home. The article didn't stay long in print. It did, however, seed conversations. People left comments about the responsibility we have to one another. Others wrote letters and offered to volunteer. Some asked how they might do something similar in their own towns. Henry, when asked, would say, gently and with a candor he had chosen to keep, that money alone doesn't heal. It creates opportunity. The real work is in what people do with the opportunity. Before she died, Rose had made a small request for a final detail, that the front door be painted the same color as the door she'd loved in her old house. "It will remind me of where we started," she said, smiling, "and it will remind others that we once had one door, and then had to find another." The door was painted and repainted until the shade was right. The green became a kind of signature, neither ostentatious nor understated, an emblem of the life they had made. In the years that followed, Rose House expanded modestly, an extra wing added by a group of carpenters who had learned to be caretakers, a small community garden behind the garage where residents grew parsley and thyme. The trust that Henry had instituted made sure that the work could continue in perpetuity. Henry, for his part, aged into the role of gardener with a contentment that surprised him. He'd kept a desk in the back office for legal matters, but most mornings you would find him at dawn on his knees in soil, whispering nonsense to seedlings as if coaxing them into life required conversation. On the lawn of Rose House stood the lemon tree planted on the first day. By now taller, its branches weighted with fruit. It produced enough lemons for pies and enough scent to perfume the air near the front door. Children from the neighborhood would sometimes come by and climb on the low stone wall, and an old woman named Dorothy would call out the names of every child she had known in the town, as if time were a list you could recite with pride. The last letter Rose wrote, tucked into the trust's file, became a small sort of scripture for the house. It was quoted in orientation packets and hung in the kitchen in a neat wooden frame. Visitors would read it and pause, and often tell the staff that the line had changed their day. A home is what happens between people who show up. Simple, true, a summons, not a judgment. And so the story that began with a Mercedes driving away and a suitcase left on a curb ended, not with vengeance, but with a redirection, a repurposing, a quiet insistence that wealth could be turned into shelter, and that shelter could be turned into belonging. The revenge that shocked the town was not a revenge of spite. It was a moral correction. It used the tools of inheritance to fund mercy, not to punish. It asked that those who had failed in love might yet have an opportunity to learn it. When asked about regrets, Rose would sometimes answer with a wry shake of her head. "I regret expecting things to be different when people's hearts were never obliged to change," she'd say. But then she'd lean forward and add, "I don't regret making a place that kept someone warm." Her words hung like the lemon scent in the air, simple, persistent, and bewilderingly hopeful. In the end, the green door stood as a testament, a paint color chosen not out of spite but out of memory, a signal that some doors close so others open. The lemon tree kept producing fruit in seasons that had once seemed impossible. The small blue clipboard, once a marker of institutional pacing, hung by the nurse's station, repurposed with handwritten notes about birthdays and visitors, a symbol of how systems might learn to become humane. Rose's last years were unremarkable in the best possible way. They were filled with the small rhythms she'd always loved. Tea in the afternoon, a neighbor's visit, the occasional thunderstorm to make the roof sound alive. She died surrounded by those who had shown up. When the staff read her final letter during the small gathering after she passed, there was no grand eulogy, only stories, pies, and the way people held one another. Henry placed a sprig of lemon on her favorite plate before carefully sliding it into the sink. Marcos and Anna, who had been the unlikely harbor where the story turned, stood together under the green door and watched as people remembered the life of the woman who had taught a neighborhood to be a home. "A home is what happens between people who show up," the note read, and it echoed in the kitchen and in the garden and in the small, ordinary rooms where people came to be seen. It echoed in the hands that built, in the hands that tended, and in hands that finally learned that what we bequeath to the world is only as good as the people who steward it. If this story moved you, leave a comment below about someone who showed up for you when you needed them most, or share this with someone who believes that dignity is worth protecting. If you want to help elders in your community, check the description for resources and ways to volunteer locally.